Okay, so let's talk about the 5 process groups. Initiating establishes the vision, what the project will accomplish, and it defines and authorizes the project or a project phase. And we'll talk about the various documents later in the course. Then the planning process group, and this is a large majority of what a project manager does, establishes the total scope of the project and defines and refines objectives and plans the course of action to obtain the project success for which the project was undertaken. So again, when you're doing your application, you don't want to underemphasize initiating, because as we talked about ethics and the PMI code, we want to be absolutely straightforward with it, but you don't have to give a whole lot of examples of initiating, because as we saw in the question layout yesterday, there were very few, in terms of percentage, that's a much smaller participant in the overall scope of a project. So planning is big, though. You should have a lot of examples of when you actually perform planning. And then executing integrates and coordinates the people and the other resources to carry out the project and deliver the agreed scope. Now, executing is generally the largest phase of a project, but as a project manager, you definitely have roles and responsibilities in planning, but that is not something that you want to give a large majority of your time to, because in a lot of worlds, the project manager is also a worker bee on the project. So you don't want to confuse when you were actually a worker on the project and when you were a manager on the project. And if you put too many of your executing experiences into your application, they will consider that potentially not so much managing as you had a dual role, kind of a two-hat thing going on. And then you've got monitoring and controlling. And even though it often shows up in this 4th component, remember that monitoring and controlling happens across all of these process groups, like we saw in the picture right there. So monitoring and controlling encompasses it all. So in other words, there you're trying to look at variances and look at trends and try to keep the project on track. So again, you want to have in your application, probably second only to planning, you want to have expertise showing in monitoring and controlling. And then finally, closing formalizes the acceptance of the product, service, or result, because remember, that's what our temporary endeavor as the project was intended to do. And this takes everything to an orderly end. And again, closing is fairly small in terms of the percentage of questions and in terms of the number. I think there's now we've only got 1 process left in, of the 49 in closing. So again, you shouldn't put a whole lot of emphasis in your application on closing, although you should have some. So the project flow is a potential for the order of events that occur during a project's duration. So, and of course, all during the project, we want to collect and analyze data to make good decisions. In other words, what we knew at the beginning, and I always use my example of child rearing. What I knew before I had children was I thought the complete and utter be-all, end-all of child rearing. And once I had kids, I learned a ton. I probably got as smart or smarter as I did between, to my kids' point of view, between high school and college, when they thought I knew nothing when they were in high school, and now they're hopefully coming around a little. So we've got a diagram here, and of course, the PMI method is intended to fit any life cycle methodology. So whether you're using a waterfall, or whether you're using a spiral, or whether you're using an agile development strategy, this diagram is intended to show you that the work processes can go through any life cycle and still apply the PMI principles. So some of the key terms and some of the important data that we're going to collect include the work performance data, and this is the raw data. How many hours were worked, how much progress was logged, how many resources were used, say if we're using paper or metal or wood or what have you. Then the work performance data is evaluated and collected and creates work performance information. So then we can say, we've used half of the budget, or we've used 3/4 of the wood, or we've used 10% of the furniture or whatever that we've set up for the project. And then that work performance information is coordinated and analyzed and looked at by the project management and the project management team potentially, and that results in a work performance report. So that report basically goes to the higher level, maybe in a synopsized form. It goes to the functional managers, if we've got an organization, say with a matrix, to see how much of their resources have been used, and also how much forward resources might be used, because just because we've used half of what we said we wanted doesn't mean we only want that much more. Maybe we've decided, oh, that resource was very useful, so we want more of it on the second half, or maybe that resource wasn't very effective, so we need more of it on the second half. So basically there's a progression here from data to information to reports. And we'll see that when we talk about the ITTOs, which is a big thing, the inputs, the tools and techniques, and the outputs for each of the 49 processes. So the project management provides a formalized project management process. Obviously, planning is a priority, and you've got to plan every activity. Plans can be executed when developed in advance, so hence the need for the project management organization, that you have some template plans so you don't have to start every project or every iteration of a life cycle with, with a blank page. And hopefully planning ensures that the process is well thought out, and that the roles and responsibilities of each participant are well known, so we don't have confusion, rework, dual work, redundancy, and conflict. And again, we want the greater good to drive the project decisions, not just the proverbial looking for our keys where the light is good, and not necessarily where we lost them. And again, the plans need to be done at a level sufficient to determine the strategy, approach, and potential risks. So this is a little bit new in that predominantly in the older versions of the PMBOK, the plans had to be finished before we moved forward, but in a more agile life cycle, obviously, you're going to do a lot more. Plan a little, and then do a little, and then maybe replan. And then again, you want a plan that provides strategies for handling risks when the risks appear. So the project process can have various different kinds of names for the elements of the process, and these are what PMI uses. So we've got the phases, which are a series of phases that a project passes through from start to completion. So whether that's in a waterfall, the typical requirements design, implementation, testing, deployment, or whether it's spiral where we're iterating in a lot of tight circles, or whether it's agile where we work a little bit in kind of 24-hour sprints. In theory, that all of these fit into these processes. A phase gate is the review at the end of a phase in which a decision is made. Do we continue on with this project? And then a process group is a logical grouping of project management inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs that go together. And a knowledge area is a defined area of project management. Again, we talked about the fact that we have the 10 knowledge areas. So here's how the process groups interact in the life cycle of a project. And again, this is just general, which is why there's no actual units on either axis. But initiating obviously starts early and peaks early and ends early. The planning process group is a big share early, but it still ends a little bit early, whereas executing starts a little bit slower than planning, but the top of the peak and the area under the curve is a little bit larger, and then it ends just prior to the end. And then the monitoring and controlling is kind of a smooth curve from start to finish and covers the whole project. And then closing starts sometime probably after initiating is complete, and then reaches a peak very near the end, and then goes obviously all the way to the end of the project. But again, That is how a project works, and not how your participation in project management should be depicted in your application. Probably in terms of proportions, the planning group should be the biggest, the monitoring and controlling should be the second biggest, and then the executing should be the third biggest, with closing and initiating being the smallest. Which doesn't mean recast something into a different role. It just means just pick roles in various projects that cited those skills. So here's a process group interaction for a sequential project, and basically here you start with decommissioning a facility, you clean up the waste, and then you landscape over it. So this would be a 3-phase project, and it shows how the various process groups interact. You know, basically you start with initiating all of them, you do your planning, you do your executing, and there's a little bit of a feedback loop there, and then throughout the whole thing you're monitoring and controlling, and then you close. And so for each phase you do one of those different things. So, you know, you start with decommissioning, then you clean up, and then you landscape. Okay, so project life cycles are usually the phases of a life cycle. And remember, the knowledge areas and the process groups are not phases of a life cycle per se. But the phases of a life cycle, whatever life cycle you choose to use, represent the discrete units of work to be completed on the project. So there are various classifications of the life cycles. You could have sequential or overlapping phases, and again, you may have some parallelism, which is, you know, has both positive for the schedule and negative for potential rework and getting smarter and having to do something different. And then you've got predictive life cycles or plan-driven life cycles, where things are more determined in advance. So, you know, kind of your typical waterfall type of life cycle. Series of for large projects, which are well of the project. And obviously each phase focuses on different activities and requires different skill sets. Okay, the Agile Mindset, and this is a newly emphasized area in the PMBOK 6. So anyway, the Agile techniques apply to newer, more research-oriented projects that haven't exactly entirely solved the problem. Obviously, if you're building your 4th Starbucks, you understand all the concepts involved in building a Starbucks. But if you're working on a self-driving car, not all those bugs have been worked out. So you might want to start with assisted brakes or the lane change indicator, but you want to make sure that you don't go beyond the technology that's available. So, but again, Agile has a higher degree of uncertainty, and so you've got a lot more potential for going, you know, following a path that's maybe not successful. So again, it emphasizes short cycles, often called iterations or sprints, and quick adaptation based on evaluation and feedback, so you don't go too far down a path that is not productive. Hence the early airbags that deployed too quickly and broke people's faces and arms as they deployed. So again, you want to do a little bit at a time and make sure what you've got going works, and then it works in concert with the next thing, and so on down the line. So here's a PMP exam tip for the project framework. It's not just on the framework, but on the application of all the knowledge contained in the framework. So remember, I said that there's a basis of legal and economic and interpersonal communications and all kinds of skills involved in the project framework beyond the PMBOK, because remember, the CAPM test is the test that is just on the PMBOK. So this includes a wider realm of things that you've just done in your life, things like Lean Six Sigma or Agile development. So again, you know, there'll be scenario questions, framework questions, and input-output questions that solicit different kinds of answers. So we're going to talk about, next we're going to talk about the 10 knowledge areas to talk about each of the individual processes. So here is the chapter 25, or the page 25 figure that I was talking about, oriented the other way. So this lays out across the 10 knowledge areas across the top, the 5 process groups down the side, and then the 49 processes within where they're slotted in the matrix. So you can see that initiating only has the 2 processes, and closing is down to the 1 process. And predominantly, we see the processes in the planning realm, because basically every knowledge area develops a plan. At any rate, so here are the 5 project management process groups, the 10 knowledge areas, and then the 49 processes. And ideally, you want to learn and understand these, and it's kind of a daunting matrix to memorize, but as we go through the knowledge areas, because that's how the PMBOK is designed.
Where is the PMBOK? Is this is page 92?
This is page 25. Page 92 of the slides, page 25 of the PMBOK.
Okay.
But on page 25 of the PMBOK, it's oriented the other way. So it's got the process groups across the top and the knowledge areas along the side. But at any rate, and so the PMBOK is organized in this way, so that the first 3 chapters are the framework kinds of introductory basis information, and then chapter 4 starts with project integration management and goes on through project stakeholder management is 13.
Okay.
So ultimately, this is the organization of the book, of Rita Mulcahy's work, of the class material. So basically that's what, if you study with any outside materials, I would suggest something organized in this similar way. So at any rate, but in order to, for the memorization part of this, what you'll come to know is that, for instance, everything in the planning knowledge area, or most everything, has plan in the name. And everything in the monitor and control area usually has monitor or control in the name. So in close has close in the name, and then, so the only ones that are tough are initiating, and that's easy, easier because you can only have to remember 2. And then in executing, you've got the active verb like direct or manage or acquire or implement, conduct, kind of things. So there are ways to make this easier to remember, and the process names generally give you a good idea of the process, not only where it fits in terms of knowledge area and process group, but also in terms of what it does. And when we get to the badly named ones, I'll point those out. So any questions on this part?
Nope.
Okay, so again, we talked about the 5 and the 10 and the 49, and each different knowledge area. So integration crosses all of the 5 process groups, because obviously integration is bringing everything all together. So a philosophy that you might want to use is, after you've read through the whole PMBOK, go back and read chapter 4, because when it initially talks about everything in chapter 4, it's a little bit like loose threads, that you don't have all the underlying knowledge, but once you do have the other 9 knowledge areas, it kind of brings everything back together. So, and you notice there's only 2 in initiating, and then now we'll talk about the process framework. So again, all project management work can be described by one of the 49 processes, and this is across any discipline, in any region, in any culture that PMI has encountered. And again, a process is defined, and I spoiled this a little bit earlier, with inputs, tools, and techniques, and outputs. So again, most every exam question will tie back to a process knowledge area or a process group, or to professional and social responsibility. But again, not just in the PMBOK, but in the wider realm of what you know in the world. So each process has inputs, tools, and techniques to carry it out, and outputs. And that it's important to know which processes have outputs that come from, or that go to other processes, and which processes take their inputs from other processes. That's another kind of question that will be asked of you. Again, very PMI specific. So there are common inputs that have some similarities. So two of the big ones are enterprise environmental factors, or EEFs, which is basically anything external to your project that you as a project manager or even as the project management office can't really change. So these are, say, government regulations, corporate culture, because you're really not going to change the corporate culture unless that's what your task is in the span of one project. So basically all of the outside kinds of things, the economic environment, whether engineers are plentiful or they're hard to find, whether the regulatory environment is difficult or rather lax, and that again would vary from region to region. So when you think of EEFs, enterprise environmental factors, think of external. So the E kind of goes along with everything else. And then you've got the internal items, or things that you actually have control over, and these are your organizational process assets. So those are things that you as the project manager, or in a projectized organization, the project management office, control. So, I don't know why my phone is talking to me, excuse that. Anyway, so the organizational process assets are all the internal kinds of things. And then other common inputs are the project management plan. Obviously, the project management plan is the overall spine of the project documentation. So you could say that all of the plans for the 10 different knowledge areas are separate plans, and because we're talking about a large, long-lived, distributed, multi-million-dollar project, they probably are separate books, but really they're subcomponents of the overall project management plan. And then work performance, and remember we talked about the 3 phases of work performance, that you start out with the raw data, and then you work that data around through some analysis and it becomes information, and then the information is organized into a report of various levels of information to the various levels of management. So those are some common inputs that lots of the processes have. And again, here's some terms that you should know, and I think we've mentioned at least all of these. Well, we haven't mentioned expert judgment, but again, expert judgment is your expert judgment either as a project manager in that realm, or you rely on, say, if you move from the healthcare organization to the oil patch, you have someone who you can rely on to confer their expert judgment. So basically, make sure you understand all of these terms, and in fact, if you could before the end of the course, or if we go next Wednesday, look through the glossary of the PMBOK, because just about everything there is necessary and relevant to know for the examination.